And it just reminded me as we were talking that what Ryan did for the city of Atlanta, it goes beyond a project. It's a story, and everybody refers to it now as a story. And there's many, I think there's many levels of that story. On the one hand, it's a story of a person who went to school here, did a project, had an idea, and that idea evolved into what we know now as the Beltline. It's also a story of the power of ideas. And this is the one that I think that continues to resonate, especially here in an academic context, that he had this idea that has become a $4 billion public-private partnership that's transforming Atlanta. I mean, that's a pretty powerful idea. And then it's a story of how somebody can engage with the city and just through a series of activities, events, and just initiatives, have a real impact on a place where you live. And I think that's what Ryan has done. He, as most of you know, he's an urban planner, he's a designer. He recently started a consultancy called Six Pitch. And most recently, he's been brought on as a consultant to the city of Atlanta by the new Commissioner of City Planning to help envision the future of the city, to help develop real planning ideas, develop smart strategies toward the growth of the city. And that's a really exciting development, I think, for the city. So that's really all I have to say. Ryan just completed a book, which is going to be around for signing after this. It's a book, Where We Want to Live, right? Mm-hmm. And it's, I haven't read it yet, but I'm sure, again, it's probably going to be another great story. So, on behalf of the School of Architecture and the School of City and Regional Planning, please welcome Ryan Gravel.
Thanks, Scott. Can y'all hear me all right? Perfect. I love this idea of talking about a story, because the book is definitely a story. It's written as a narrative. It's not too wonky. It's a story about the relationship between infrastructure and the way we live our lives. There's lots of stories in it. I'm happy to tell you any number of stories today. I'm kind of winging it today, though. I do a lot of talks. I've done several talks here at Tech about the Beltline and the big ideas behind it. I'm happy to answer any of those questions or tell that story again if you want to hear it. But today I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about the book itself, my experience at Tech, what happened here, and what's happened since, where my personal sort of story is going. And then we'll open it up to questions in a few minutes. I love the idea of story too, because one of the stories that I learned lots of things in writing the book. I learned a lot about the Beltline itself that I didn't know before, because coming out of school, I was, a fairly green kid, 27-year-old, with not really ideas about how you would make this $4 billion project come to life. I learned a lot in the process, and I learned a lot about sort of where it came from. The other story that I learned a lot about was my own. And I always wanted to, I love the idea of starting a talk with a picture of my grandma. That's my grandma there, and a sort of perfect picture of American suburbanization in the 1940s. My grandfather in the back with the tie, they got married in Alexandria, Louisiana. He was a banker, and his boss convinced him to buy a house, since he's going to have a family, to buy a house out on the edge of town. I don't know, because they're both passed, if they got one of those FHA loans that was only available to white people, but they were certainly part of the expansion of the classic sort of American picture of early suburbanization. That was a really powerful movement, a cultural movement in this country that more recently, through the advancement of civil rights, is available to everyone. But we're learning a lot about that story, and the Beltline certainly provides the context for that story. Anyway, so like I said, I'm kind of doing something new here, so I'm gonna stumble around a little bit while I talk. Let's see. I think I could just, I don't know if I pressed the right button. Sorry, I think I messed it up. It's just going to rotate through some slides. You'll see another picture of my parents, well, me as a kid in the schoolyard at my school when I grew up, where I grew up in Chambly. My parents had moved us to Chambly from Louisiana in the early 70s. There we are. That's me right there in the back with my eyes sort of closed. We moved to Atlanta to take advantage of the booming economy that was a direct result of the highways that were being built around the city. Literally, we bought a house in a neighborhood that was incentivized by the construction of 285. In the same way those apartments are popping up along the Beltline, we moved to the perimeter highway at the time. My dad took a job, he was an engineer, designed pump stations and wastewater treatment plants to support the sprawling economy of the region. And literally the economics of that highway investment, the highways that we were building at the time, lifted millions of Americans to economic prosperity, including my own, and put dinner on my table and sent me to college here at Georgia Tech. And so that relationship in the process, these slides are just going to go through, I'm going to sort of talk about them. It might be distracting maybe. So that infrastructure really, sorry, that sort of, yeah. These are going to be distracting to me, sorry. I'm used to using the slides as like cues for what I say, and then now it's saying all kinds of things. It's putting ideas in my head about what I should talk about. But anyway, I learned a lot about my own family history in that process, and it was fun. So the book has been a real discovery in that way. And what are we doing?
I'm going to pause it for you.
Oh, cool.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That's a nice slide. Except it's, well, it doesn't matter. I can use my notes now because I'm completely disoriented. So another story was in Paris, and you saw the slide of the, I wonder if I can, yeah, perfect. I'll do them manually like I usually do, except these slides are still kind of crazy. Oh, there I am. My apartment in Paris. So part of the big story with the Beltline, of course, is my year abroad in Paris. I did a year here, my senior year. This is the view from my apartment. You can see the Gare de Lyon. There's my mugshot there for the Metro Paris subway card. And you know, within a month of arriving, I'd lost 15 pounds. I was in the best shape of my life because as a kid growing up in Chambly, driving everywhere we went, here I was like eating fresh food and you know, walking wherever I went. And the relationship between the built environment, the physical city, and my own personal health and well-being became clear to me in a way that it really hadn't been before. And I became fascinated with the role of the city, the role of the physical form of the city in shaping the way that we live. That it's not just, infrastructure isn't just a way to move people around. It's not just a way to convey water and sewer and electricity, but it's the foundation of our economy. And more than that, it's the foundation of our social life and our culture. And I became really interested in that role. And then I came home. I went to work for an architecture firm out on Windy Hill. I lived with my parents in Chambly. I drove every day on the top end of 285. And the juxtaposition of my year abroad in Paris and, you know, being stuck in traffic on 285 was pretty jarring. And so I started thinking about how we might make Atlanta into something more walkable, something more wonderful. Not that it has to be Paris exactly, but what is it about the infrastructure that we built, and what can we do with our infrastructure to reimagine what we are and who we are as a people and as a place. And so that's another story. So I got interested in that, and then that architecture job was, and I hope he's not here, I learned a lot about architecture professionally and how it goes together, how you put a set of drawings together, and my boss was really great. But we were doing suburban office parks, and I kind of felt like I was part of the problem and not part of the answer. And so that's what really drove me to come back to school at Georgia Tech in city planning to sort of solve all the problems of the world. And then just couldn't get away from architecture and design in 3 dimensions. And so stuck around for my architecture degree as well. And my thesis had to bridge that gap between design, but planning also, so design at a city scale. I was obsessed with railroads, because that year in Paris, I came back looking at what layers of infrastructure formed this place. And they were railroads, of course, largely in the beginning. And they went everywhere. And there was this loop of railroads that went around the city. And they were, kind of fascinating. It became a cool space for that. And, you've probably heard the rest of the story, and I don't need to necessarily repeat it. Unless you want to ask me the question later, I will, I promise. So another story is that when those early days with the Beltline, we created this amazing grassroots movement in support of an idea. This wasn't sort of a top-down project proposal from City Hall, and it wasn't a developer scheme. This was the people of Atlanta fell in love with the vision that they wanted, and that story exists because there were a handful of us that were doing an enormous amount, going out and just sort of selling this story for people. I was doing 3 and 4 public meetings a week, and so was Kathy Willard, our leader at the time in City Council, and a handful of volunteers, and we sort of created another story for Atlanta that gave the momentum and impetus to sort of follow through. The timing of that story was really special, and I'm gonna read a couple sections. I'm gonna read something. It'll take about 4 minutes, maybe. Hopefully that's not too long. So this is about the timing of that movement. Timing was part of what made the thesis different, of course, because the city was starting to grow. What really set it apart, however, was its ambition to change our lives. The particular ideas of this proposal were put in service to a vision that would accomplish more than just basic infrastructure, and that's how it was proposed to the public at large. It would change our lives, we said, and also the way that we think about our lives. The thesis went so far as to suggest that, quote, Atlanta can seize this chance to redefine itself with a new understanding of city form and redefine urban life in the 21st century South, end quote. The fact that the Atlanta Beltline came from an academic paper with no notion that it could actually be built permitted such bold statements to be made. And this notion should not be underestimated. In contrast to previous proposals for the Beltline loop, the thesis proposal had the advantage of being unfettered by reality. For example, it ignored many facts of the day, that some of the railroads were still operating, that the city didn't own any of the land, that regional funding for bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure was pitiful in those years, and for transit essentially non-existent. That the state at that time had a stranglehold on MARTA's ability to improve or expand service, and that local politics were notoriously rife with naysayers, infighting, and lingering racial tensions. It didn't concern itself much with other priorities that were competing for both funds and political attention, and it looked beyond the constant and seemingly more immediate need to address issues like crumbling sewers and failing schools. Politically, the weight of those other demands never translated into a force powerful enough to shake the Atlanta Beltline from the public's imagination. The bell had been rung, and nobody could unring it. As our small group of believers took our vision to the public starting in the summer of 2001, the project's innocent origin allowed people to suspend their disbelief and focus first on whether it was a good idea before getting lost in the challenges of details. Broad public opinion coalesced around an aspirational view of our future. The proposal developed a powerful following of residents and organizations that began to require that any nuts and bolts debates about the details like competing priorities and funding be put in service to the project's realization, not the other way around. In this way, the idea was not only remarkably refreshing conceptually, it was able to break through any disbelief that such a big vision was possible. It was attainable, so we could believe in it, and if it was doable, then we should do it. The project's innocuous origin as a graduate student thesis played another role in these politics of possibility. It was an ambitious vision, but somehow it wasn't threatening. It gave community activists something to fight for, not against. It represented neither a public sector transportation agenda nor a private sector plan for real estate development, even though it satisfied both outcomes. At the same time, it was not an edict coming down from City Hall, which would have carried political baggage. While we did get essential early leadership, it would be a few years before the weight of the political establishment got fully on board and started to make the Atlanta Beltline a priority. The proposal's ability to generate these unusual alliances was at least partly due to its academic origin. It could be trusted and evaluated on its merits without causing speculation about ulterior motives. Described in this way, our success so far makes a powerful case for academic environments everywhere to be nurseries for ideas about the future. Unrestrained by budgets, politics, physics, or technology, students are empowered to be inventive and to develop big ideas that solve real problems. They are free to make proposals without knowing all the answers. Actually, not knowing is a key to their strength because they are able to imagine things that many of us rarely see anymore. Outside of academia, it is easy enough to find excuses for not being ambitious, not enough money, lack of creativity, political or corporate bureaucracy, voter apathy, or the general inertia of the status quo. Inside academia, however, with all of the problems facing our world today, there's little excuse for not taking advantage of such valuable time to explore. And in fact, there may be no better place to take risks, develop ideas, or articulate a larger ambition for our lives or for the world. Who knows, a curious and unassuming thesis might happen to go further than anybody ever thought possible. So you can see that the story is a story, and it's still quite evolving, but that Georgia Tech played an enormous role in it. And I was sitting on a panel earlier today talking to some prospective students, and of course, having arrived at Tech, it's such a much more beautiful place than it was when I was here. The campus is incredibly nice now compared to the way that it was. But the stairway still smells the same here. So it kind of really takes you back directly to those days. Basically, I was here for the 90s. Spent a long time here and a lot of late nights up and down that stairway. So it's nice to see that as much as things change, that it's still the same place and still probably with many more resources and much more expertise. Sort of bridging, providing students the ability to explore and be bold. And I'm a big believer in like I just read, students sort of playing a role in sort of imagining our future. And I would say children generally, I have 2 kids now. Another story that's happened along the way. My daughter just turned 11 yesterday, and my son is 8. And they sort of were born in this Beltline story. And when we were at the book launch at the Carter Center about a month ago now, it's standing room only, a big space with 500 people. It's pretty amazing. And my kids, they know a little bit. They know the Beltline. Obviously, we live on it. But they're sort of sitting around like, what are all these people want to know about? So it's cool to see their lives. What's really cool is that, like I said, I grew up on 285 there in Chamblee. My life, my worldview was shaped on 285 between Buford Highway and Perimeter Mall. I remember Perimeter Mall before, when there were cows across the street, before the invention of a food court, but my kids' worldview is being shaped by the Beltline. And their worldview is, of course, Atlanta is the kind of place that you can ride your bike to the grocery store. It's the fastest way to get to the grocery store. And for those of you who've been around Atlanta a while, and a lot of you are young, you may not realize that that's a really unusual proposal to make or thing to think, but for them, it's just normal. That's just the kind of city that they live in. So it's exciting to see the power of ideas to change the world. And that the world that's changed then is the basis on which even bigger things can change. That's why I like the story of the Beltline so much, and why I'm sort of interested and willing to go around and share it everywhere I can. And I have a unique sort of opportunity to go around. I was just in Montreal earlier this week and get to speak all over the country and around the world about the project. And it's fascinating to see what's happening in the world, that the Beltline is really part of a much larger story. And that's partly one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, is so that people here really see what's happening see the Beltline for what it is, which is a leader, but in the story, but also part of something really much bigger. Everywhere I go to, every city that I go to, there is some similar transformation. I'm going there to share our story, lessons from what we've done. But I always learn something there. There's communities there reclaiming some old railroad, some degraded waterway, some obsolete roadway, everything from the High Line in New York City to the Los Angeles River, which I'm particularly obsessed with because it's the 51-mile concrete channel. Most people don't even realize LA has a river. The Army Corps of Engineers paved it in the 30s, literally paved 80% of a 51-mile river. But just 2 years ago, they approved a $1 billion restoration of one small section of the Glendale Narrows. So you can see how these projects are they're catalysts. They're not only changing the physical form of the city, they're changing the way that we think about the city, and they're changing the political structures, the business structures that really shape and frame and build our way of life. I'm fascinated with sprawl, and the book talks a lot about sprawl, hopefully in not a critical way exactly, just a more matter-of-fact sort of informative way. It started as a vision for our future, and you saw the image there, the historic image in Los Angeles. We call it sprawl now. We were building the foundation of sprawl when the LA River was paved, there it is. But we didn't call it sprawl, we called it the future, and it was part of a much larger cultural momentum that included science curing diseases and going to the moon and the sexual revolution and the civil rights movement, our world, our culture, who we are as a people can't be separated from the physical world that we're building. And so if we really want to be thoughtful about a more equitable future, a more sustainable or healthy future, then we have to think about all those things. And we can't think of it just as a sort of planning exercise or just a design exercise. That these are, it's a creation of a new way of life. And what I love about these projects is that they're catalyzing something new. And what I love about infrastructure in particular is that it's kind of an under the radar kind of tool for cultural and social change. I'll read something else that sort of describes you a little bit better idea of what fascinates me about infrastructure, because you'll see it's not exactly the sort of engineering side of it. So I did my year abroad and my senior year in architecture, but then during graduate school, I did a summer trip with Richard Dagenhart and others. And following that second trip abroad, my studies in graduate school turned deliberately toward the role that infrastructure plays in enabling a life of both productive and unexpected encounters. This included a design studio called Incidental Infrastructure, where I met my future wife, and Richard was the professor of that studio. He's responsible for me getting married, maybe indirectly. We investigated adaptations to MARTA's train stations. Karen took Garnett and I had King Memorial. We still argue about which station is better. We were among a lucky cohort of students that overlapped with professors Randy Rourke, Richard Dagenhart, Doug Ellen, and David Green, who pushed a pedagogical model that actively engaged students with the civic life of the metropolis. We worked on projects that could be real, and we connected with actual people in the agencies and organizations who might benefit from our work. We provided an academic laboratory for the generation of ideas that straddled that middle ground of imagination, bold enough to be worthwhile and realistic enough to be accomplished. Our lab was set at the reasonably dense center of Atlanta's otherwise spread out landscape, and while I was enamored with Rem Koolhaas, there were also other influences. One came from a reading assignment in the Journal of Architectural Education. It was written by Alyssa Rosenberg, a professor of landscape architecture at the University of Virginia, and she delivered the challenge to me very simply. The relationship between urban function, this is a quote, the relationship between urban functions and the natural environment has become increasingly opaque. The ancient power of water, for example, was understood through its physical presence in many forms. Wells and cisterns, street fountains, and aqueducts once occupied a significant place in organizing urban space. Now a vast system of underground pipes makes water appear magically at the turn of a faucet. Water has consequently ceased to play a meaningful role in the design of cities. I was hooked. Rosenberg's article took me back to Paris. George Haussmann's rebuilding of Paris in the 1850s and 1860s perhaps best illustrates the ways in which engineering of the infrastructure became an ordering principle at an urban scale in the modern city. That's also a quote. Words like those are tonic for infrastructure geeks like me. And my obsession with the role of infrastructure in the cultural development of cities has only grown with the success of the Atlanta Beltline. When it is done right, infrastructure can even be sexy. It is seductive. It dares us to go places we might not otherwise go. It is muscular. It shoulders the underlying weight of our social life and economy. It is brilliant. It stimulates us to express ourselves through art and literature, to start a new business, or to invent some new technology. More potently, however, it is sensual. Infrastructure forms the physical and sensory space in which we live our lives. In a role similar to that of nature, the public realm made up of infrastructure can have a warmth, breath, scent, and glimmer that combines to create suitable conditions for humans like you and me to catch each other's eye, fall in love, share our first kiss, comfort a friend, or empathize with our neighbors for being present, even anonymously, in the routine of their everyday lives. Infrastructure gets us home in time for dinner, lights our way on a romantic stroll, and draws our bath for a quiet evening at home without the kids. Of course, infrastructure can also turn cold. It can limit our ability to do those things. If we want it to, infrastructure can almost ensure a dull and unproductive condition for living. The reason we so seldom think of infrastructure as sexy today is because we have value engineered all the sex out of it. Which is kind of fun. So you can see that my sort of interest in infrastructure is more sort of cultural and social, but that whatever it's doing, whether it's building highways for cars or transit or sewers, that it plays a role in the shaping of our lives, and that if we were thoughtful about what kind of lives we want, we might make some different kinds of decisions. And what ties all these projects together, and literally everywhere from Memphis to Milwaukee. I was in Singapore this time last year, and they have a 15-mile abandoned railroad across their whole country island. And they see the Beltline as their leading model for what they're going to do with it. Not because of the physical transformation of the railroad, although that's part of it, but mostly because they want it to be, they want it to support and create the life for the communities along the way that people want. And that's pretty amazing to see, and so I'm a big believer in this sort of role of infrastructure as a catalyst for much larger change. So that's really it that I was going to talk about. I mean, there are two main reasons why I wanted to write the book. One is what I said, to sort of let people see that that the Beltline is part of a much larger story. Because I think that if people in Atlanta see it that way, we'll double down on it and we'll build it faster. And certainly there's an opportunity to do that this fall in the MARTA referendum that will be in the city for a half-penny sales tax to support transit investment in the city limits. The Beltline obviously being a big part of that. The other reason I wanted to write the book is because this is a long story. And if you're a city planner, you know that that's sort of your game. We operate on these long-term sort of timelines. But in my mind, the Beltline is still this grassroots movement, right? And because we built that movement, I know more than anybody that the only reason we're building it is because people wanted it, and they made it happen. But if you're 25 today in college, then you were 12 at the time. And you weren't obviously paying attention to how the city is formed and built, or politics. And so, and now today for a lot of young people especially, I think the Beltline feels like a big government project. And I think that I would love for people to be reminded that they own this thing, that it's theirs, and that you can add and do whatever with it that you want. And the Beltline is so much more than it was in that thesis project. The thesis is just the kernel of an idea. Most of what you see today, including the trail, frankly, including all the parks, including the arboretum, all kinds of different of the sort of physical aspects of it are new, and they came with, because people owned it and they had a sense of authorship of it, they added their layers to it. There are people now, right now, talking about pollinator plants and bocce ball courts and farmers markets and all kinds of other things. They have ideas about how they want to use the Beltline to restructure their lives or provide assets or amenities to the city that are needed or wanted. And I hope that you will too. And I hope that we're at the very early stages of implementation. We have a long way to go. It's transformational already. We can imagine how much more it will be. But in that change, obviously, are our lives and the stories of our lives, and we want to make sure that they are inclusive and equitable, and that we all get to stay to enjoy the benefits, that they're the benefits that we want. And so I'm hoping that the book plays a role in sort of reviving that kind of dialogue around ownership and authorship of the project. So anyway, I've sort of talked for a while. Sure, hopefully y'all have some questions. I'm happy to answer. As Scott said, the book, after we're done, we're over in the atrium of the other building. You can buy the book. I'll sign your book if you already have it, or you can buy it there, whatever you want. Yes?
Yeah, so you mentioned focusing on making this equitable.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what sort of mechanisms you are talking about with the city to ensure that as property values go up, folks aren't displaced.
Yeah. Well, to be clear, I'm not in charge of anything anymore at all. Never really have been. And so that's not really my decision to make. But what I will tell you is that there are things that are happening. Mostly that the vision that we built in the beginning, and I didn't tell that story, but the Beltline came out of a grassroots citizen movement. Literally, I was working for an architect. We were doing mixed-use urban infill type projects. We were trying to decide, do you take the parking garage and jam it up against the railroad, or do you orient it somewhere else? I was talking with my coworkers about that problem and what we should do. I told them about this idea I had in school, and they thought it was cool. And we started talking more about it, and the more people that we talked to, the more people wanted to hear it. And we started this grassroots movement of a dialogue about the city's future that I had alluded to. And that included everybody. And that movement over, I was doing 3 and 4 public meetings a week for 2.5 years, and so was, a bunch of other people. But it was all over the city. It wasn't only in the east side of town. I was living in Southwest Atlanta at the time, where we lived for 12 years in Capitol View and Sylvan Hills. It was our friends and neighbors there too, across every socioeconomic, racial, every kind of divide you want to imagine. This was a truly grassroots movement, inclusive sort of movement. And so because of that, embedded in that vision is an accountability to people. And so the reason why in the tax allocation district we have 15% of the money goes to affordable housing is because we were trying to be accountable to the people. We were writing the rules. We were forming the organizations that were building it. And so embedded in that is not only some of the mechanisms for ensuring some measure of equity, affordability, but also an accountability. Because right now you can look at the Beltline and it looks like a success. And certainly from an economic success it is. And from an economic standpoint it is. But if we look at the full sort of breadth of the vision, I'm not sure that we can quite yet call it a success. Now it's early, and we have lots of time. We have time to fix it. But because people are at the table, there are things going on that can help. The Beltline Partnership put together some existing tools that are available to people who are on low or fixed income to help. We created a land trust collaborative that's able to leverage, the problem is that the problem is financial. The answer is not to not build the Beltline. The answer is not to provide communities with transit and trails and grocery stores. The answer is not to hold communities down to keep them affordable. The challenge is to find the tools, the financial tools to help people. And unfortunately in the South, in Atlanta, we don't have a lot of those tools. Other places do. But it's not rocket science. There are things that we can do. What it takes is political will. And in order to get that political will to action, we have to speak up. So when I'm talking about us all being more vocal about it and owning this project, that's part of it, is speaking up on issues that matter. Certainly issues of equity and affordability matter. There are lots of things that we can do. For example, in Cobb County, once you hit 62, I think, you don't pay the school portion of your property taxes. In the city of Atlanta, that would be half your property tax bill. That would be an enormous savings for people who are low or fixed income, but we're not even talking about it because it's such a political, whatever the expression is, it's not gonna happen. Unless we all say that that's what we want. You know, the Beltline is just too hard, it's too big, it's too expensive to do without some pressure to do it. And the reason why we're doing it is because the public's expectation is that we will do it, and that empowers and has even obligated the elected officials to do it. So if we continue to be vocal about it and say how we want it, then we can, I'm certain we can achieve that goal. Yes.
Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
Thanks for talking to us today.
Oh, yeah.
I have a quick question. So I talked to you once about sidewalks before, but I wanted to know, is there a plan for the Beltline to expand out here to like the Chattahoochee River so we can walk from like in town to like a trail out there?
This is one of the ideas of the catalyst. So it's catalyzing change along this corridor, but it's also catalyzing changing the way that we think about it and what our expectations are for the places that we live. The Beltline can't solve all of our problems. It can't itself connect everything. That's just not possible. But it is certainly inspiring other projects. And so there are other projects that are planned to link to the river. In particular, there's several actually. One is the Proctor Creek Greenway that would connect the Beltline, downtown Beltline out to along Proctor Creek to the river. There's an organization formed to build it. There's some money behind it. I don't know all the details, but my understanding is that it's going to happen. The other is the Connect the Comet initiative to extend the Silver Comet into the city. The railroad the Silver Comet is built on comes to within about half a mile of the Beltline, and so making that last link is not a problem. Obviously, the railroad still owns that railroad. The state has a story to play in it, a role to play, but obviously that would connect to the river along the way and also in. There's another trail that I'm going to forget the name of. One of the projects that I've been working at with Six Pitch, my new consultancy, is around is for this group called Chattahoochee Now, and they're looking at the river from Cumberland Galleria downstream for 50 miles, including that section of the river that's on the city's riverfront, basically. And we're developing a vision for how you might get to it, including everything from trails to transit to park and ride and all that stuff too. So opening up that part of the river. Right now, the problem with that part of the river is you can't go there. There's nowhere to go. There's not a park or a boat ramp or anything to go to. So working on that. Yes.
In the book, you talked about how much of the original idea was about connecting to four existing MARTA stations and then adding ones in infill ones. Give us a little update of where we're at on that.
From a transit standpoint? Yeah, I mean, the Beltline, the idea is that it's a loop, and so it crosses each of the four compass points of the MARTA rail line now. There's some technical problems with the west line because it's underground at that point, and there's not a station. Unfortunately, the MARTA stations were not located anticipating the reuse of this loop for transit, so we have to go out of our way a little bit to connect to MARTA or build these new infill stations. On the Proctor Creek line that veers off the west line, there's not a very real opportunity for an infill station that would connect directly to the Beltline. On the north line at Armour, there's an opportunity for infill. It'll be interesting to see if those two projects make it into the MARTA referendum this fall. I think that they should and could. The transit, obviously the tax allocation district, because of the recession, we don't have the money that we had anticipated, but it's still very much planned. You can look at the strategic implementation plan online and see where that is lined up to happen. But the referendum in the fall could build the transit. I mean, it's enough money to build the transit on the Beltline and then still have $1 billion to do other projects. So it's an enormous investment. Would be unbelievable for the city of Atlanta to make that level of investment in transit over the next, the referendum is for 40 years, but you could bond against that, so you could build it much sooner. It'd be unbelievable, really powerful. So that would obviously accelerate the transit implementation even beyond the plan that they have online right now. Yes?
You said that part of the success of your proposal was due to the fact that it came out of academia and didn't have all the political baggage associated with it. You're still involved with Georgia Tech and city planning Atlanta. Do you see other proposals coming out of the school that seem promising, and more broadly, like what projects are coming down the pipeline for infrastructure in Atlanta that you're most excited about?
I wish there were other projects in Atlanta that I was excited about. The Chattahoochee Now project was a option paper thesis that came out of Tech from Jody Mansbach. I know that there are others. I'm not going to think of them off the top of my brain right now. There are a lot of other sort of trail projects in particular that are planning to connect into the Beltline, which are interesting to watch. I love the idea that other communities outside of Atlanta want to sort of connect into the loop. I think that's smart and cool. Mostly, I think we're continuing to build bad projects. And the one that comes to mind that I've been talking a lot about lately, just because I can't help it, is the managed lanes project right now from I-75 Cumberland area out past Town Center Mall. It's a nearly $1 billion highway project. It's long stretches of elevated highway, and without supporting policy, growth policy at the other end of that highway, it's just going to cause more problem. It's going to create more sprawl. It's basically going to suck the value out of Cobb County and put it out in Cherokee County. Why the folks of Cobb County would want to do that, I don't know. I suspect it's because they don't think that way about infrastructure. But I think that one of my hopes for the Beltline and for this book and the story is that we start, in all the questions that we talk about with the Beltline today, we talk about equity, we talk about affordability, we talk about what it's doing to communities, walkability, livability, health, all those kinds of things. We should ask the same questions of all the infrastructure that we build. Right now that project, it's set to open. You're not going to be able to ride your bike on it, can't walk on it. There's no conversation about equity. There's no conversation about what it's going to do to communities on this end or that end or along the way. There's no conversation really about it at all. We're just doing it, and we're spending nearly $1 billion. And so that's an example of, like, if we started asking these questions that we appropriately ask of the Beltline today, if we start asking them of all the other projects that we're building, we would change the way that we do things. We would change the decisions that we make. Yep.
So talking about bad projects and just regional cohesiveness in terms of having a centralized political goal in terms of doing that, like how do you motivate an entire region that's so fragmented
I don't actually think I don't believe the region is fragmented. Actually, I think that, it seems like it is, but our leadership is fragmented. I'm not so sure that the people of the region are fragmented. And maybe I'm like naive about that, but then again, I'm a big fan of naivete, actually. I live now on Krog Street, and I see people park on Krog every afternoon, every weekend, people unloading their dogs and their strollers from all over the region. Their license plates are Cherokee, Rockdale, wherever. And they're coming into the city. They're walking up and down the Beltline all day. They're spending their money in the city, which I think is great. They're changing their view of what life in the city is all about and how awesome it can be. And they might be changing where they choose to live. They're certainly going home with ideas about how they want to change their communities. I think that, there's a lot of opportunity and possibility for people if they have something to sort of believe in. What the Beltline gave the in-town neighborhoods of Atlanta was a vision that was better than what they saw through their car windshields. It was better than anything that City Hall was proposing at that time. And it galvanized them to work for something that was really positive for their communities. And I think that if the region was given a similarly interesting, captivating kind of story about its future, that the region would similarly buy into it. In any case, it's about to change fundamentally anyway, because the suburbs, and this is part of the book too, the suburbs are no longer, they're not what they used to be, you know. When I was a kid, Gwinnett County was blow and go white bread growth. I mean, it was nothing other than office parks and strip malls, and most of the benefit came, just to be blunt, for white people. But today, Gwinnett is the most diverse county in Georgia. It's the majority minority community. That infrastructure, that infrastructure can provide the economic success that it did to the initial people who settled in Gwinnett, I don't know. But that's sort of part of the problem. But the people of Gwinnett, certainly, they're not voting for some reason because the county commission does not reflect the diversity of the county, let's say. But once they do start voting, then Gwinnett is going to flip, and the power of Gwinnett flipping regionally is that Cobb County is never going to be able to pretend like that the suburbs are still going to dominate growth policy in the way that they have historically. You know, Cobb's having its little Mississippi moment. You know, they're sort of fighting the future. They're going to lose, but they're going to figure it out eventually. And when they do, you know, really the dynamics are really different, because it used to be that it was very much an us and them kind of thing with the city versus the suburbs and the state. But when the suburbs start seeing themselves and their future tied much more directly to the life of the city, then the politics of the state changed pretty fundamentally. And that's exciting to sort of be a part of. I'm a big fan of Atlanta. I'm super excited about being here. I mean, there's no reason to go anywhere else. I mean, I get to travel quite a bit and see other cities, and they're beautiful, and they might be maybe more beautiful places to live. But you know, San Francisco is always going to be San Francisco, and Boston's always going to be Boston. Atlanta's going to be a different place in 20 years, completely. And so to be in the business of what we're talking about, that's maybe the most interesting place to be. So I think we have in Atlanta a real opportunity to lead on issues of equity and affordability and growth policy in a way that a lot of places don't. And it's unexpected because we have this sort of reputation for sprawl, but I'm real optimistic about it. I'm not even sure if that's even relevant to your question. Yes.
I wanted to ask about kind of maybe some challenges associated with, because so many people love the project and you know it's bringing so much value, it's starting to get more and more densely packed. And so
Yeah.
on the weekend, it's like you're getting a huge
It's
density
ridiculous.
of pedestrians and bicycles. So do you perceive that as a problem? And if so, how do you plan on kind of addressing that as a
I see zero problem with people wanting to be in a place where you are, you know, in your community. I think that's really positive. I think the success of the East Side Trail illustrates a real pent-up demand for something else. I think that the reason that these projects are emerging everywhere is because people want something else. Their leadership is not giving it to them in most places. And so when it's available, they sort of flock to it. And so I think that hopefully the Beltline inspires more Beltlines, not literally more Beltlines, although that would be cool. I'd love to repurpose 285 for something more life-affirming. But you know, inspires other ideas, other things to, you know, bring more opportunity for that kind of place. And maybe in the future, the Beltline isn't that special because that's just the way that we do things. That's the power of my kids' sort of worldview being shaped by this, is that, yeah, that's the way we build infrastructure, we build Beltlines, you know, or LA rivers or whatever else, you know. I think that in the future it'll be less of a sort of magnet because it'll just be normal, which will be good, I think. Yes.
In Atlanta, what's your feeling, I guess, on professional sports names that are popping up and
Oh.
creating more community.
You know, I have a funny thing about professional sports. I'm not really into sports myself. I know that might surprise you. But I actually I love them in a way. They're sort of interesting cultural sort of experiments. You know, I like to go to watch people. You know, I'm not really watching the game. I'm watching how people interact. And people love it, and I think that's interesting. You know, I really do. I think people are interesting generally, and so I like to watch people. I think it's awful what's happened with the Braves. I think it's bad for everybody. I think it's a big missed opportunity to do it right. There are ways to do sports teams right, and obviously that wasn't happening where the Braves were, and so it's not pointing fingers at anybody. I think most people who were involved were at least partly at fault. So I don't. I think Cobb County will be really regretting it if they don't already. The rest of the region will. I think the worst part of the Braves' decision to me is that we're creating a real problem for transportation, and we're not going to be able to ignore it. That intersection, that part of the region is too important from an economic standpoint that we can't just say, oh, to hell with it, let it happen. We're going to have to fix it. And the cost of fixing it is going to be astronomical. And what it means is that very good projects, otherwise life-affirming projects across the region, are going to get bumped down the priority list of projects. And it's not like me moving my dentist office across town. You know, to move a big stadium like that is a real regional impact, and we should have been able to talk about that, whether that was a good idea or not. Because we've been, as taxpayers, investing in Turner Field for a long time. We've spent a lot of money making that a relatively suitable place for a baseball stadium. And I know there's all kind of conflicts with, the people who are really benefiting are the neighborhoods immediately adjacent to the the Turner Field. But even then, that could have been done in a way that supported them. You could have the baseball team and have vibrant, successful communities. So the Falcons, I don't really have an opinion about that. I don't like how Martin Luther King Jr. Drive got cut off. I think that's really offensive. But nobody asked me. Until you did. It's too late. Yeah.
We should probably shift.
Okay.
And the Braves aren't very happy about that either. Have they won a game this season yet?
Oh.
Anyway, so
Yeah,
Ryan,
great.
thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Yeah,
We're
thank
gonna
you.
Move over to the atrium, and books will be for sale, and Ryan will be over there to sign.